Dr. Andrew Reinmann, who will be speaking to us on the early detection of hemlock woolly adelgid infestations using freely available remote sensing products. Dr. Andrew Reinmann is an ecologist and biogeochemist who focuses on plant ecophysiology and the terrestrial carbon cycle. He is particularly interested in understanding the effects of environmental change, that is climate change, urbanization, and land cover change, on the drivers of plant-mediated controls of terrestrial carbon cycling and nitrogen dynamics as a limiting nutrient across a continuum of human-disturbed ecosystems. His research draws from multiple disciplines and combines field observations, ecosystem experiments, and laboratory analysis with GIS, remote sensing, and modeling. Dr. Reinmann currently has projects in forested and human-dominated landscapes throughout the mid-Atlantic and northeastern United States. Welcome, Andrew. We're honored to have you here today, and the virtual floor is all yours.
Great, thank you so much. I was having some connection issues earlier, so if I'm breaking up at all, just stop me and I'll maybe turn off my camera or something. All right, so let me share my slides here. Okay, can you see my slides okay?
Yes.
Yes. Great, thanks. So thank you so much for the invitation. This is a really exciting opportunity for me. I should start out by saying maybe different from some of the other speakers in your series, my background and training is formally as an ecologist and a field ecologist at that. And over the years, we've just started to integrate more and more GIS and remote sensing tools into what we do. So I probably come at these sorts of questions from a little bit of a different perspective than if my background and training was sort of primarily as a remote sensing scientist. And so where that places me is probably in a position where I try to find like some simple way to use remote sensing data to kind of answer or solve some scientific problem. That may mean that there's some level of sophistication that we're not incorporating, but I hope that a small benefit of that is maybe there's ways to develop tools that are readily available and sort of tangible to practitioners that, like me, might not have sort of a lot of formal training in remote sensing science. Okay, so I imagine if you're attending, you already probably have some background in Eastern hemlock, why it's important, but I figured I would start off just going through just a brief overview of the ecology of this really important species, why we care and why we're concerned. So Eastern hemlock is considered a foundation species. These species are those that define ecosystem structure and can exert strong controls over a variety of ecosystem dynamics. In the case of Eastern hemlock, throughout much of its range, it's the most shade-tolerant tree species, it's long-lived, and in many locations where we find it, it's one of, if not the only, conifer species that's capable of sort of perpetuating itself in some sort of a pure or nearly pure stand. And that's because of its high level of shade tolerance. And as a result of that, it creates a unique ecosystem type and a unique sort of microenvironment that tends to be cooler and damper. And during the winter, it can provide refuge from deep snow for a variety of different types of animals. And then over the past several decades, this species, this forest type, has been under attack by an invasive insect called the hemlock woolly adelgid, which is this little aphid-like insect that is wreaking havoc on these forests and ultimately causes mortality of trees over the course of 10 to 20 years or so. Many of you are probably familiar with what a healthy stand looks like. And just to give you a sense of what that progression looks like, of course, we start out with these really dense canopies with a really dark understory. And once these trees die, the canopy opens up quite a bit and lets a lot of light in. And during this period of progression of the infestation, there's a lot of large impacts on a variety of ecosystem processes. And I think perhaps maybe the best way to sum that up is looking at how the progression of this insect can change overall carbon cycling dynamics, which is sort of linked to so many different ecological processes. So here's data from an eddy flux tower at Harvard Forest, which is in Massachusetts. And so these towers measure the amount of carbon dioxide moving in and out of ecosystems, and they're a really great way for tracking productivity over time. And so they have this tower in a nearly pure hemlock stand. And going back to 2005, you can see, there's interannual variations. But then shortly after an infestation is detected, we start to get a decline in productivity. And really over the next 6 or 7 years, there's a really large decline to the point where enough biomass has been lost and that biomass starts to decompose, that these forests go from a net sink for carbon to a net source of carbon, meaning they're releasing more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere than they're able to sequester. And in addition to just these carbon implications, losing this really important tree species has really important implications for biodiversity and for water quality. As I mentioned, it has these important impacts for microclimate. And part of this is that it can keep streams fairly cool, which increases oxygen content and then facilitates supporting a variety of important fish species like trout. Depending on where you are in the hemlock range, once these hemlock forests are lost, they tend to get replaced by black birch. Of course, in northern New England, northern New York, and adjacent areas of Canada, it will not be black birch. There isn't black birch there. Perhaps other species like yellow birch may be the tree that replaces it. Time will tell. So currently, there's not a ton of compelling evidence that eastern hemlock is exhibiting much in the way of resistance to this. And so really the only natural control so far is things related to temperature. We don't have any native organisms that seem to be feeding on it in any meaningful way. And so I sort of think of temperature as being hemlock woolly adelgid sort of kryptonite. And what this work shows is that it's really cold winter temperatures that can play a really important role in sort of curbing the spread or progression of an infestation. And you can see from this graph here that as temperatures get to be -15, -19 or so Celsius, we get really large amounts of mortality. Some other work has looked at it a different way and looking at it as a duration of time below some temperature threshold, but the stories are generally similar. Cold temperatures are generally bad for the adelgid. Of course, there's a big but to this, and that but is that there seems to be some evidence that hemlock woolly adelgid may evolve to become more cold hardy. And depending on when during the winter that cold weather hits, they may be more or less resistant to it. And of course, like the problem we have with many aspects of forest health and invasive species is these things are likely to interact and perhaps be exacerbated by impacts of a warming climate. So currently areas in Canada and adjacent areas just to the south in the US that might regularly get winter temperatures that are sufficient to cause widespread mortality of the hemlock woolly adelgid, warming winters could reduce the frequency of those cold snaps that help to keep the populations at bay. Recently, there's been a little bit of modeling work, sort of tracking where hemlock is and projected progression of the insect. I apologize that part of Canada gets cut off in this, and I really hate now being like speaking to you as an American that so many of our maps seem to cut off part of Canada, and I really apologize for that. We do have most of the area in Canada where we can find hemlock, but we miss some important areas in New Brunswick and parts of Nova Scotia, and I apologize for that. So this map is showing the extent of hemlock woolly adelgid around 2017. That's here in this dark green line. And then also the distribution of hemlock itself. Areas where you have the darker green, those are the areas where hemlock is most abundant and most common. If we were to look at a 2021 map, we would see this line up here, especially in parts of New York and parts of Maine, have crept north a tiny bit. And so this area here, the parts of the interior of the northeastern US, this is kind of the heart of the hemlock range. It's a really common species. It's widespread. You find a lot of pure stands of hemlock. And this is the region where HWA has been found recently or is expected to be found in the coming years. Here's some of this modeling work that estimates the likelihood of infestation around 2015. So of course, like the southern 2/3 of the hemlock range, almost every stand has been infested. And then moving forward to 2030, of course, the expectation is that that moves northward. The exact role that cold winter temperatures are going to play in slowing that, I think, remains to be seen. But as I mentioned, the combination of the possibility of the insect becoming more cold hardy and us having fewer really cold winters likely sets the stage for some sort of a realization of what these model projections are. Perhaps the small amount of good news is that there seems to be some progress being made on treatment options. So of course, for a while, people have used different types of pesticides to control the insect, and this can work out okay at the tree scale or scale of a small stand. Obviously, this is expensive. It's not a solution for landscape or regional scale problems. And pesticides themselves have a potential suite of negative impacts that we'd like to try and avoid. And so there's been a lot of work focusing on trying to find biological controls. As a sort of practitioner and scientific community, I guess we have a long history to draw from of the mistakes that have been made in using biological controls. And so I think a lot of those lessons that we've learned are being put to good use here. And here's some of maybe the more promising organisms that are showing some amounts of success at controlling hemlock woolly adelgid. With any of these options, though, they're really most effective early in the infestation. And as a result of that, it's really important that we have tools in place to identify new infestations as early on as possible so that we can identify places to target some of these treatments. And so over the past couple of years, I've been working with some remote sensing scientists and some practitioners in the field of invasive species management, especially in fields of controlling hemlock woolly adelgid across New York State. And so the big question that we come away with from these conversations is, can we develop low cost and really importantly, practitioner-friendly tools? There's plenty of examples of really great sophisticated remote sensing tools for finding areas of declining hemlock forests. But at least in conversations with practitioners that I've had, almost no one uses a lot of these remote sensing models in their work. And part of that could be that you may not have training as a remote sensing scientist to be able to reproduce those models, and there could be a really steep learning curve to being able to use those. So what we wanted to do is see if we can develop tools that work, don't cost a lot of money to run, and perhaps someone with some GIS experience could reproduce what we create. So currently, field surveys are the primary detection tool. And a colleague of mine from the Nature Conservancy, he has this great phrase to describe their approach to this. And he said that deciding where to send field crews is a little bit like throwing darts in the dark, because you're trying to find new infestations and you don't always know where it's going to be. So you're just sort of hoping to get lucky, not that there's an infestation, but that you're able to find it. In the places where field crews look, this can be highly accurate because you can see the actual adelgid. However, this approach is resource intensive. It requires a lot of people, a lot of money. It's time consuming. And because of those limitations, it can limit the spatial coverage and temporal coverage of these detection tools. And this can be particularly limiting in more remote and rugged terrain. And at least in a lot of the places that are of a lot of concern here in New York State, like in the Adirondack region, a lot of those forests are remote. The terrain is really rugged, and it's difficult to get to all of those locations where there's hemlock forest. As I mentioned, remote sensing can provide really useful tools for detecting declining stands related to hemlock, woolly adelgid, and all other sources of declining forest health. But depending on the types of data that are being used to run these sorts of models, those data sets can be costly, and sometimes these tools can be difficult to use without extensive training. And so as a result, again, at least in the conversations that I've had with practitioners, these tools maybe don't get as much use as we would like. And so, as I mentioned earlier, through these collaborations across ecologists, remote sensing scientists, and practitioners, we sort of put forth this question of through partnerships among researchers and practitioners, can we sort of advance the sophistication or utility of early detection tools? And so in these conversations, some of the things that come to the surface are these tools need to be inexpensive or based on free data sets. A lot of the organizations that are sort of on the front lines of identifying new infestations have a lot of resource limitations. And so being able to do this on the cheap is really important. And of course, any models that we develop, ideally, they can be reproduced without much in the way of specialized training. Like, can we just put together a step-by-step protocol that someone with GIS experience could then execute? And then some of the key needs of some of the hemlock, woolly adelgid practitioners that we talk to, they say, well, first, knowing where there's hemlock trees is really important. That seems like a pretty basic thing, but there aren't always great maps of delineating the distribution of our species of interest. So that would help to, I guess, ameliorate some of the throwing darts in the dark scenario that a colleague of mine had mentioned. And in addition to knowing where the hemlocks are, being able to detect stands and trees that are declining health is really important. I guess on the scientific end of things, folks really want to be able to identify decline and what that source of decline is. And I think on the practitioner end, while that would be wonderful, just having some indication of where there's species of interest that are in decline would be great, because that, again, really helps to focus where you send those field crews for validation. So I don't think the goal here is to replace the use of field crews, but to better target where we send them and to make more efficient use of them. Okay, and so to start with, of course, as a hemlock stand declines from hemlock, woolly adelgid, foliage gets lost and the canopy becomes less green. And so here's just some hemispherical photos showing what that progression might look like in our healthy stand. Of course, the understory is quite dark. As stands decline a little bit more light comes in. And then when we start having all these dead trees, you can really see the canopy opening up. And so along that trajectory, if you're looking down at the canopy, it becomes less and less green. And so there's really great tools now for a long time that allow us to measure this sort of greenness from airplanes and from space. And a common metric that gets used is a vegetation index called the normalized difference vegetation index. And the way that it works is it kind of takes advantage of the fact that plants absorb light in the red and blue ends of the light spectrum, and not so much in the near infrared. And so by looking at sort of ratios of visible red and near infrared, you can develop these metrics that are responsive to the amount of foliage in the canopy. And so as this NDVI value increases, we can sort of think of it as indicating that vegetation or foliage is becoming denser and denser. And as it decreases, that vegetation is becoming less healthy and more sparse. And so this gets used a lot for looking at spatial variations and temporal variations in canopy health. It can also be used to track seasonality, because of course, at least in deciduous ecosystems, although this is true to a lesser extent, even in coniferous systems, there's sort of a seasonality in kind of how green leaves are, or how much how much chlorophyll is in the leaves, and so we can track that to look at seasonality. So it's useful for getting at seasonality. It's useful for understanding health. And so there's a variety of ways we can do this using freely available data sets. First, perhaps the most well-known source of these sorts of data is the Landsat satellite, which is run by the US Geologic Survey and NASA. This has a 30-meter spatial resolution, meaning that each image that it collects has a pixel size that's 30 meters on a side. It passes over the same point every about 16 days. And there's data that goes back to 1984. So that time horizon that exists is really better than pretty much anything else that we have. More recently, the European Space Agency put in a constellation of satellites called Sentinel-2. These have a 10-meter resolution. So while Landsat, the 30-meter resolution, you're talking about a dozen or more trees in the canopy that you would be looking at. Here, each pixel at only 10 meters resolution, we're talking about just a couple of trees. So it probably increases the sensitivity to detecting decline from any individual tree. The temporal passes are much more frequent, but these satellites only went into orbit in about 2016. So we can only go back so far in time to look at changes in canopy health over time. Some other freely available data sets, at least here in the US. I apologize, I'm not sure if Canada has a similar type of program, but here the USDA has the National Agriculture Imagery Program, where the idea is to, in an airborne platform, fly the entire contiguous US every 3 to 5 years during the leaf-on period. So that can be, in the northeastern US, anywhere between, June and maybe September, or sometimes even early October. This is done every 3 to 5 years, but the actual number of time slices you can get will vary by location. And this program has been in place since about 2003. Now, the resolution is super fine. You can get individual branches, whereas with these satellite-based platforms, you're talking about clusters of trees. Another important thing to note about the difference between these platforms is the satellites are sensitive to clouds because they're in space. So anytime an image is collected, any part of that image that has clouds in it, you can't really use those data. And so even though you may get images every 16 days or every 5 days, the numbers that are actually useful are generally much fewer than that. The airborne data, because it's by airplane, oftentimes the cloud issue isn't really a factor. And then at the state level, many states in the US, I imagine this is true at a provincial scale, maybe in Canada, we have an orthoimagery program. And this is leaf-off imagery with a sub-meter resolution. Most of these images are about 30 centimeter resolution. And these images are all, again, they're leaf off, and every 3 to 5 years, though that can vary from state to state, but this tends to be pretty consistent across states. Depending on the state, data may be available back to the 1990s. And again, you don't have to worry as much about the clouds using this approach. Okay, so these are some of the different data sets that we started working with because they're freely available, and they give us, for the most part, the sorts of coverage that we want for the regions that we were interested in. So the first thing we set out to do is try and figure out, well, where are the hemlock trees? So we focus some of our work in the Catskill region of upstate New York, which is a few hours north of New York City. And so this is sort of what that landscape might look like during the growing season. And just visually, you can see it's really difficult to discern where there's a hemlock and where there's deciduous trees. And a lot of these forests have deciduous trees sort of co-occurring with hemlocks. And this, of course, is true in Canada as well. And this is where there's a virtue of leaf-off imagery. And so here's from Google Earth, just looking at the leaf-off imagery, and you can very clearly see where there's conifer forests. So we can use this imagery in conjunction with things like topography and elevation to, try and exclude conifer forests that might be like spruce and fir, like this patch here, from hemlock, which is mostly what we see here. So the leaf off imagery is really useful in helping to figure out where conifers are and where hemlock are in a landscape that has a variety of different species. In addition to helping us to sort of see the canopy trees, a real virtue of the leaf off imagery is that while in some of our peer stands, hemlock trees are the dominant tree in the canopy, where hemlocks co-occur with deciduous trees, oftentimes they can be overtopped by those deciduous trees, and those trees would often get missed by any sort of mapping product that would rely on leaf on imagery. And so here, I'm showing you a stand where there's a lot of hemlock, but they're mostly in the mid and understory, and during a leaf off period, we can easily see those. So let me show you how this works out. So I'm going to show you an example from the Adirondack region in northern New York. We take that ortho imagery and we use sort of the false infrared color to just, for purposes here, just sort of making those conifers pop. And just to kind of give you an idea of that resolution, if I just zoom in, you can see individual trees, individual branches. Here you can see where there are some dead hemlocks. We'll come back to this in a second, just to give you a sense for the resolution of what we can pick up using the ortho imagery. So then what we can do is we can use the normalized difference vegetation index to identify where on the landscape there's conifers. And we can do this at scales as fine as 30 centimeters or so. Generally, we find is doing this at a 1 or 3 meter resolution is more appropriate and greatly reduces sort of the computation requirements. So with those maps, then we can do something like overlay the grid of Landsat, which is 30 by 30 meters, and develop sort of this continuous cover conifer product. And this kind of will, both of these approaches help us to make better use of remote sensing imagery, but also help us to figure out where we might want to target field crews, because we'll know exactly where hemlocks are and what proportion of the canopy they comprise. And then we can run these maps at a landscape and larger. So here's a snippet of an area of the Adirondacks. All the white areas are either pure deciduous forests or lakes like we have down here. But you can see the sorts of resolution that you get with this sort of product and its capacity to help to identify where there's conifer forest versus, or where there might be hemlock forest versus not. And this little black box is just zoomed into these areas that I showed for an example. So this approach allows us to at least get out where there's conifers. And now some of our colleagues have been working with a variety of different data products to develop these 30-meter spatial resolution products that indicate sort of probability of hemlock being there. It doesn't tell you what proportion of that area is hemlock, but it does tell you sort of the likelihood based on topographical features, elevation, things along those lines. And so what we're doing now is we're taking this conifer cover product, sort of merging it with this hemlock probability model to then create a high resolution hemlock distribution model. And we've sent a protocol for how to do this off to our colleague at the Nature Conservancy, who's a practitioner, and he's working through it now. So that'll sort of be our test to see if once it kind of leaves the academic community, can it actually be useful by the people that will do something with it instead of us that just sit in our offices and try and like come up with new things to look at. Okay, so the next thing that we did, once we get to the point where we can identify where there's conifers and where there's hemlocks along the landscape, is we wanted to test the utility of this ortho imagery for looking at decline. And again, I'm spending a lot of time here focusing on the ortho imagery because it's super high resolution, it's leaf off, which maximizes our capacity to see where the hemlocks are, and it's free, and it seems to exist in enough of a temporal frequency that we can track decline. And I'll come back to some of these other products that I mentioned later in the talk. So here's an area that's zoomed in an area of the Catskills. And then in the next slide, I'm going to run through a series of sort of maps and images for this 30 by 30 meter area. Here's what that looks like zoomed in. So each one of these pixels is something like 30 centimeters on a side. And here, all the reddish, that's all green foliage. Okay, so I'm going to go through a time series from 2009, 2013, 2016, and 2021. This is all the same location, and you can see that really large decline in hemlock vigor and also that increase in mortality over the course of this 12-year period. The next thing that we did is we tried to use this ortho imagery to better understand how important spatial resolution of a remote sensing product is in detecting change. So we started with our highest resolution product. And so here, each of these pixels, each one of these images is exactly an NDVI representation of the image you're seeing above. The darker the green essentially means the healthier the canopy is. And so you can see, we capture these spatial variations. This little area of yellows and purples corresponds to maybe some exposed rock or bare soil right here where there's no vegetation. So we can really capture a ton of spatial heterogeneity in canopy greenness. And then as we move forward in time, you can see this product capturing the decline in canopy health. And you can start to see these last trees that survive, they wind up being these last little splotches of green also in our estimate of NDVI. So at this resolution, we can track decline. Now, when we move that up to a 3-meter resolution product, we still have the spatial resolution to detect decline. You can see like some of the big areas of decline, like right in here in 2009, that was still pretty green. By 2013, those values drop a lot, and that's an indicator of decline. And you can see sort of like the frequency of those dark greens declines over time, indicative of sort of the progression of hemlock woolly adelgid. When we go up to 5-meter resolution, we still see a lot of those same patterns. And then at 10 meters resolution, we can still pick these things up, but we start to lose a little bit of that sensitivity. And then by the time we get to a 30-meter resolution, which again is what Landsat is, we can pick up decline, but in a way less sensitive way than we were able to with those finer spatial resolutions. Just to give you an idea, here's what those NDVI values look like. We can see the biggest change between 2009 and 2013, and then it kind of bounces around a little bit thereafter. And so this is an extreme example because this is an area of pure hemlock where there's been a lot of mortality, right? So this is the best case scenario for detecting decline using these coarser resolution products. And we expect that if this were a scenario where there was only, let's say, one tree in decline, as spatial resolution becomes coarser, our capacity to detect that decline is going to drop. So then we took all these data across a large area and we put some numbers to it. So on this graph, I'm showing the progression of NDVI, so that's that greenness metric again, over time in stands that the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation had identified as being in a severe state of decline in the red versus a moderate state of decline or moderately healthy, depending on whether your glass is half full or half empty kind of person. That's what's in green. And these error bars here, this isn't really like an uncertainty number. This is just the variability across all of the pixels. But if we were to track one individual pixel, we would see this very clear trajectory. So this is where it kind of highlights the importance of tracking an individual location over time rather than just looking across space for one snapshot in time. And so our severely declining stand, we can see that really large decline, and our moderately declining stand, it declines, but at a much slower rate and seems to sort of level out sort of the second half of our measurement period. And this was where this gray bar is, that's the year that the stand's health was assessed. So we can see decline. So right now, 2021, a lot of these trees are dead. but we were able to see that decline just within a couple of years of when that infestation occurs. So that suggests that this can be used as an early detection tool. We don't need to wait for trees to die before we know that, that they're infested. And then we can look at this, the same sort of data, but then aggregated at different spatial scales, again, to better understand the utility of ortho imagery versus something like Sentinel-2 imagery at a 10-meter resolution or Landsat imagery at a 30-meter resolution. And this is that same suite of stands, the moderately healthy, the severe decline, and then the difference in the NDVI value between the two. And this is just that change over that time period. And really what's of interest here is how big is the difference in the NDVI signal between healthy and declining stands. And we see at both that 0.3 and 3-meter resolution, they seem to be both equally good at detecting that decline, but as we go up to 10 and 30-meter resolution, some of that sensitivity declines. Here's just another way of looking at that. What we did is we identified individual dead trees and then looked at what their NDVI signature was like, aggregated at different spatial scales. So of course, at a 0.3-meter resolution, we could very easily distinguish a dead tree from a living tree. We can do that really well at 3 meters and at 5 meters. Once we start getting larger than that, now we're getting multiple trees within the same image. And so the signal of any one dead tree is starting to get diluted by other green trees nearby. And so we can wind up losing some of that sensitivity. We also quantified a Z-score just to really get at what that signal to noise ratio is at different spatial scales. And the way that's calculated is we take the mean NDVI value of a live tree, we get the mean NDVI value of the dead tree, quantify that difference, and then divide it by the standard deviation of the living trees. And so the larger that number is, essentially the greater our capacity to detect, in this case, a living versus dead tree. And again, you can see really like 5 meters and higher resolution, we can do a really good job of getting that. 10 meters is where things start to fall apart, and then our capacity to detect that at these coarser resolution products becomes lower and lower. All right, so how do we put some of this to action? So I'm going to run through a quick example from the Catskills, just sort of spatially. This is about the region that we're talking about here. And here's one of the stands that the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation delineated as being infested and in a state of decline. In the ortho imagery, here's our first year of data. Here's the most recent year of data. And you can see all these little silver cap trees. Those are hemlock trees that have died during that time period. You can also see areas where you're getting some thinning in the crown, and those trees are on their way to dying. So what we can do is at sort of that pixel or tree by tree basis, we can quantify the rate of decline in greenness or NDVI and come up with this map where we sort of break things down based on the magnitude of that decline or the magnitude of the slope in NDVI over time. And so for where we've been working, it sort of seems like a slope with these sorts of values indicate patches of forest or trees that are under rapid decline. The orange with these sorts of values, that's sort of a moderate rate of decline. And what we have is yellow. Those seems to be trees that are in a slow rate of decline. They're still declining, but at a fairly slow rate. This is really useful because oftentimes field crews are categorizing an entire stand. And this really highlights that there's a ton of variability within a stand. And from a remote sensing perspective, being able to capture that variability is really important. And with this high resolution product, we can indeed capture that resolution. We know where trees are declining more quickly relative to others, even in the same location. So with this approach, now we can start to quantify landscape or regional scale statistics. So here's another example from the Catskills. Here we have imagery back to 2001. You can see this large swath of healthy hemlock trees. Here we are in 2021, and you can see that there's been a lot of decline and a lot of mortality. With our conifer distribution model, we can see all of the hemlock trees in green here. And then we can sort of look at what was hemlock tree in 2001 relative to what we have now. And the difference between those are the trees that are either dead or in a state of decline. So we applied this approach across a landscape. In this case, the data I'm showing you are for like a little over a 1,000 square kilometer area in a part of the Catskills. So in this, this box here. And what we found is that between 2009 and 2020, or sorry, pre-infestation, we had a little over 100 square kilometers of forest with conifers, mostly hemlock. And then over the past 12 or 13 years, what we found using this product is that about 41% of that original 107 square kilometers of conifer forest, 41% is either dead or in a state of declining health. And so our ongoing analyses, we're aiming to quantify the extent of dead and dying hemlock trees across the entirety of New York State. We could do this at broader regions too. This is a super computationally intensive exercise. So I think for now, we will stick to New York, but this approach can be reproduced by anybody that has access to this sort of ortho imagery. And then of course, combining these sorts of data with a hemlock probability model will allow us to further fine tune this to more specifically focus on declines in hemlock health. For our purposes here, the overwhelming majority of conifer forests that we encounter in this region is hemlock. And so it's less of a concern where we are, but as we move further north into the Adirondacks, into northern New England, into New Brunswick, where you start to have spruce and fir making up a substantial proportion of conifer forest, that piece can be important. Okay, so what are some of our next steps? So we want to start doing more exploration of leaf-on imagery. And this is because while the ortho imagery is great, there's other options out there, and we want to see what their utility is. Maybe there's ways to use the leaf-on and the leaf-off imagery together to come up with an even better product. And so here I'm showing you some images from the National Agriculture Imagery Program from 2011 and 2019. And you can clearly see this, 1 meter resolution product is good at highlighting where there's dead trees in the canopy. But there winds up being a lot of interannual variation in the timing of this collection. So the ortho imagery, at least for New York and some other states in the northeastern US, is almost always collected in the spring, sort of in like that window between when most of the snow melts and when the leaves come out. Very occasionally there will be a November image in there, but that's more the exception than the rule. By contrast, the USDA NAIP imagery, what we're finding, at least for New York, is some years it can be in June, other years it can be in August or September, and sometimes as late as early October. And that seasonality could present some challenges. And the reason for that is we get changes in greenness of the canopy even within a season, right? And so this is data from a phenocam. There's this network of cameras and ecosystems kind of all over the country, all over the world, that take images, multiple images every day of a forest canopy, and then they use the red, green, and blue data to come up with this index called a green chromatic coordinate, which is another way of quantifying greenness of the canopy. Here I'm showing you data for a temperate deciduous forest. So this is sort of the low conifer end of the spectrum. And you can see that between June, when the leaves come out, and October, when they start to senesce, we see a decline in greenness that's totally natural and unrelated to spatial variations in forest health or temporal variations in forest health. So if we're working with one image that's collected in June and another image that's collected in September, we would see a decline that could be just a function of seasonality and not necessarily an indicator of changes in health. And so we'd have to do extra work to account for that change in seasonality. Well, that's a deciduous forest. Even our hemlock-dominated forests, while our evergreen trees don't exhibit quite the same seasonality as deciduous trees, they do still exhibit some amount of seasonality. And from the middle of the summer onward, there is a little bit of a decline. And then, of course, a lot of hemlocks occur in these mixed forests where this seasonality will be somewhere in between this image and the previous one that I showed you. So trying to figure out ways to account for and correct for that seasonality in these time series analyses will be really important to our ability to use this sort of leaf on imagery to detect change. And so we are still exploring the utility of using this sort of imagery for detecting early stages of decline. As I mentioned, you can see clearly that dead trees show up and maybe some declining trees, but we're not quite sure at what stage in sort of a hemlock's decline trajectory can you wind up detecting that. And then, of course, there's the satellite component and looking at leaf on imagery or leaf off imagery from satellites. And so we did just a little bit of a sensitivity analysis using Sentinel-2 and Landsat imagery, where we found locations that had 0 and then up to 4 dead trees within a pixel. And then we quantified what that NDVI value is, just to kind of get a sense of how much do these things separate, because that gives us an indication of how sensitive this approach might be to detecting decline. And so what we find is that both Sentinel-2 and Landsat can both capture declines in NDVI associated with mortality, right? And that difference is obviously much larger for Sentinel, and that's because in Sentinel, maybe you have 5 trees in a pixel, and so if 1 tree dies, that carries a lot more weight in the overall greenness signal of that pixel. We can detect it a little bit with Landsat, but the signal is much smaller and sometimes they overlap with one another. And that's just because there's so many trees in that pixel that you sort of need like a critical mass of trees declining before you can detect it. And so, as I mentioned, there's this higher signal to noise ratio for Sentinel-2. There's variability, but the signal is much larger. And so that maybe suggests greater promise for using Sentinel-2 for detecting early stages of decline than Landsat. And of course, there's virtues of using the satellite-based products, but it's important to recognize that the differences that we see in NDVI of declining trees winds up being much larger with finer spatial resolution products than coarser spatial resolution products. So all these different remote sensing approaches have their pros and cons. And so depending on what exactly your questions are, you may choose one approach or another, and we're trying to work more and more to figure out, are there sort of seamless ways to kind of integrate the virtues of all of these products. But what we find is that both the leaf on and the leaf off imagery at 10-meter resolution can capture at least advanced stages of canopy decline. And so, as I mentioned with the NAIP data, we're still exploring the utility for these sort of early stages of decline. And I just noticed in the chat is the seasonality related to drought or dryness. It's sort of related to a bunch of things. So early in the season, the nitrogen concentration of leaves tends to be highest. And that's because the leaf hasn't fully developed. And it's the nitrogen concentration that seems to be an important driver of what that NDVI signal is, because it's so closely correlated with how much chlorophyll is in the leaves. As the season progresses and the leaves mature and there's more sort of like carbon-rich structures, that can sort of dilute the greenness signal of the leaf. But there's also, over the course of the season, as you mentioned, there could be things related to drought or dryness. Inevitably, there's natural fungi or insects that are chewing away at different parts of the leaves, or the leaf angle might change, and all these things can sort of work together to kind of change that greenness signal look like. So did we try different vegetation indices and compare them? So so far we've focused a lot on NDVI because we've been having good success with it. A colleague of mine who's been working on this with us, they do a lot of work with radar remote sensing. And so we tried using that approach because it's sensitive to structure. And what we found, at least for the spatial resolutions of those products that are available freely from satellites, we can't see any differences between a dead stand with dead trees and a stand with living trees. There may be more virtue in stands with in finer resolution products, but at coarser resolutions, it's just not working. There's folks that have used like tassel cap transformation and a whole suite of other different vegetation indices and have also had success detecting decline. Because we were having success with NDVI and it's such a simple thing to calculate, we have sort of stayed that route. And really what we're trying to do is figure out how soon after a stand is infested, can you start to see the changes just with something simple like NDVI. Okay, and so the last thing I wanted to mention is some of our other next steps. It's really, well, I shouldn't say it's really easy. It's easier to just look at a bunch of images and try and intuit what they mean. The more difficult part is getting enough field data to train these remote sensing products and to validate these remote sensing products. And just like with sort of any other aspect of ecology, having good data is critical. In our context here, having those good field data is really critical to the development of robust remote sensing based models of all aspects of forest health, not just for hemlock woolly adelgid. But the same problems exist here as they do for practitioner communities sending out field crews looking for hemlock woolly adelgid, right? Like this is a time-consuming and labor-intensive endeavor. And so oftentimes we may not have as much of these field data as we would like. So I think that this provides a really great opportunity for development of practitioner researcher collaboration. So we've worked with a variety of different practitioners. They're all excited to work with us, and we're all excited to work with practitioners. And a lot of practitioner groups are doing field work already. They're oftentimes doing it in different ways, though. So you could have 5 groups going out to do surveys for hemlock woolly adelgid, and they might have 5 different protocols for the data that they're collecting. And so, what in these conversations, what we did, a grad student of mine who's really interested in sort of bridging these gaps between researcher and practitioner communities, we assembled a team of remote sensing scientists, ecologists, and practitioners to try and identify some of the field-based metrics that would be really beneficial to improving remote sensing model development, and then try and understand, okay, well, are these data that practitioners are actually collecting? And if not, what are the sort of barriers to entry to collecting these sorts of data? And so I'm not going to bore you with all of these details here. We break it down into variables related to structure, composition, and condition. And then we sort of color-coded these different metrics based on how easy it is to collect the data. So green, it's a really easy thing to do. You don't need much training or fancy equipment. Red is you need more training or you need fancy equipment. For our purposes here, for a second, we can focus on this condition because ultimately it's going to be this condition that is going to be related to what any sort of remote sensing based platform is going to see. And so those condition variables could be things like canopy transparency, crown vigor, live crown ratio, something along those lines. Oftentimes, these sorts of metrics are being collected by field crews. Other metrics like leaf area index are often not collected, but it's really like leaf area and the health of that foliage that is driving what a satellite or airborne sensor sees for almost any metric of vegetation index, whether it's NDVI or something else. Measurements of mortality, this is sometimes collected, and then the presence and of course, ideally also the absence. Oftentimes it can just be the presence of an invasive species that is recorded, not necessarily that it's not there. And then the abundance of the invasive, and those things are often collected. And so kind of thinking, working with this framework and what sorts of equipment or training folks might need to collect those data, we've been starting to work with trying to take advantage of different smartphone-based apps and technologies that could be really easy for practitioner field crews to use with like almost no additional training, and allow them to collect really important metrics in a standardized way, a uniform way across different practitioner groups that can then be really useful in improving the development of remote sensing based products. And so the idea here is coming up with approaches that give the scientific community, the researcher community, the tools that they need or the data that they need, while also minimizing the burden on practitioner field crews that are going out. And so there's this app, it's called Healthy Trees, Healthy Cities, that was developed by a colleague of mine at the Forest Service and some others. While they use it a lot for quantifying tree health in cities, it was actually developed with quantifying forest tree health in the Catskills and other places with remote sensing metrics in mind. And so this is an easy to use tool. We're also, hopefully this summer, pending some funding, are going to start working with these inexpensive fisheye lenses that you can just clip onto a smartphone as an easy way to capture images that a researcher community can then use to quantify leaf area index that will take almost no additional time for practitioners. So we're hoping that through the combination of these sorts of approaches and working with practitioner communities, that we can kind of create this cycle where we're getting field data to improve remote sensing models that enhance what practitioner communities need to do, and then get more data to continuously improve these products. And then, so I see there's a question, could other data collected from imagery from drones or LiDAR help with validation? Yeah, so we've been exploring some sort of LiDAR data. There's a group that's been doing this in the Southern Adirondacks using drone-based LiDAR data. One of my colleagues, Peter Boucher, who's on this paper, did some LiDAR work at Harvard Forest in Massachusetts looking at decline. And so, yeah, I think all different forms of remote sensing data, field-based data are really, really helpful to bring to bear to trying to solve this or really any forest health related problem. So yeah, I mean, LiDAR is great. It gives you that physical information about structure. We can correlate that back to things like NDVI to maybe better understand sources of declines in NDVI. So for example, it's really useful to know if trees are declining because of a pest or if they just got blown over in the wind, and things like LiDAR can be useful for that. So I realize I'm a few minutes over. I apologize for that, but that's what I have. And I would love to hear any thoughts or questions that you all might have.
Thank you, Andrew. Wow, that was a lot of information, and I applaud you for your ongoing consultations with the practitioner group. It's in the development of your toolbox. It's really great to see. Anyway, we've already had a few questions, and thank you, Andrew, for answering those on the fly. Does anybody else have any other questions? If you do, you can either use the chat window or use the raise hand function, which is in the reactions icon in the lower part of your screen. Do I see any hands? Oh, we've got a hand. Wayne, go ahead.
Hey, Andrew, great presentation. I'm thinking about your leaf off high resolution data sets that you used. It looks like you've got a pretty good process of defining areas of decline.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering, like the process in Canada, CFIA, Canadian Food Inspection Agency, is the primary agencies that's looking for new establishments of HWA across the landscape. So counterpart to that is APHIS in the US. I'm just wondering if APHIS could have a utility of this tool to kind of point them to areas where they should focus their, new survey areas or surveillance, rather than just shooting the dart, with darts. Maybe you could use this type of technology to kind of direct them where they should be conducting their field surveys.
Yeah, right. So that's the idea here, is to kind of have these tools in place to help those field crews better target where they go. And so this summer, our collaborators with at the Nature Conservancy and also like through APHIS, they're going to go to some of the places that our model has suggested might be in decline, and we'll get information about, is it right? If it is in decline, is it because of hemlock woolly adelgid, or is it something else? But I think, we went into this like on the research end thinking like, okay, we need to find areas where we can be almost completely certain that it's hemlock woolly adelgid that's causing the decline. And when we talk to practitioners, they're like, well, when we send field crews out, we have like, 1 out of every 200 stands we go to, we're going to find hemlock woolly adelgid. So if your product gets us to 1 out of every 50 stands, you've already improved our efficiency fourfold. And in my mind, that like totally rattled me a bit, because there's a very different perspective of what success might look like. And I think researcher communities, we can learn a lot from understanding a lot of how these tools are used when thinking about how to approach these different problems. Did that kind of answer your question, or did I miss a big part?
No, that's exactly what I was thinking about. Efficiency means, a lot of dollars saved, right? So,
right.
They could spend a lot of money doing a lot of surveillance in areas that are not going to pop up, whereas you can target them, say, target these areas. These are the best areas to target if you're going to detect it, early detection of it. And also in return, just as you mentioned, you get data back to help support, calibrate your models. So.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so that's exactly the idea. Like, of course, we're never seeing the adelgid itself from an airplane or from space. We can see the impacts of it. But yeah, if all we can do is point practitioners to areas of decline, my understanding from now working with practitioners for a few years is that is like a monumental step forward from the approaches that they were currently working with.
Absolutely. Thanks.
Thanks.
We've got one more question here, Dan.
Yeah, thanks, Janice, and thanks, Dr. Reinmann, for your presentation this afternoon. And it's nice to see you in person instead of just communicating back and forth by email. But obviously, we have quite an interest in what's happening with hemlock woolly adelgid here in the province of Nova Scotia. Yep. It was detected here in 2017 and seems to be spreading very rapidly. Probably was here prior to that, before we actually detected it. And I could really relate to your, can we develop low-cost practitioner-friendly tools? Because one of the things that I find, we had someone here a while back that had a fair bit of remote sensing experience, and we were starting to look at some of the leaf-on imagery and looking at changes in the NDVI, and we were, in places like Sissibu Falls and some other locations in southwestern Nova Scotia, where we're seeing some mortality and damage from hemlock woolly adelgid, and definitely we could see some things, and we started looking at a change, over time. We went from 1 year to the next, and so on. So I think there's some real promise in that, but again, unfortunately, I lost my my person to another position here within the department, and it's just trying to find those people that have those skill sets that can do these types of analyses. And so if we can get something that's not only low cost but practitioner friendly, that a lot of us can use, that maybe aren't remote sensing specialists, that would be huge for us here, and probably for others too. So I appreciate the work that you're doing, and I have someone that's new coming into that position in the near future. So we'll certainly be back in contact with you to try to work together on how we can advance this, not only in Nova Scotia, but we're interested in the work you're doing in New York State as well.
Great. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I mean, that's the idea. Like I said, my background is as an ecologist. So I sort of figure, okay, well, if we can develop something that I can figure out how to use, I'm fairly confident that a practitioner with some GIS experience can also use it. And so we just sort of handed off like a beta version of this to our colleagues at the Nature Conservancy with our step-by-step protocol. And so I'll let you know in a month or so how practitioner friendly this approach is. But it's also something that I try using with my classes, where I give them the protocol and see if they can reproduce it. So at the end of the day, yeah, like groups, depending on where you are and what your sources of revenue are to run these sorts of things, and there might not be very much money at all. And even if there is, there's probably better things that these organizations can spend their money on than just trying to find where these invasives are. And so if we can develop easy to use, cheap tools that improve that efficiency and allow them to spend the money on like controlling invasives rather than just finding them, then I think that is wonderful. That's the end goal.
Right. So one of the limitations that we may have here, and I'm aware of Landsat, I'm aware of Sentinel, but I don't know that we have access, and maybe some of the other folks that are on the call this afternoon can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't know if we have access to really high resolution imagery like you might have in the US for doing some of the work that you're doing, especially in the frequency that you're talking about. So.
Yeah, so that's the reason why we're also looking into things like Sentinel, which is free. It has 10-meter resolution, not as good resolution-wise, but we suspect that there's still a lot of utility there. And there's proprietary satellites like Planet that will give you that 1-meter resolution data. You have to pay for it. I know they give, like at least in the US, like some academic institutions and government agencies can get some amounts of imagery for free. Maybe, hopefully, the same is true in Canada. But yeah, right. So there's limitations depending on what the data availability looks like, but hopefully we can develop a good approach using Sentinel as well.
Great, thank you.
Yep, thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. I don't see any other questions here. Dan, your hand is still up. I'm assuming that you've already.
It's getting
asked.
tired, Janice.
I bet it is. Andrew, very informative, great presentation. I have to say that I was like, how do we, I was thinking it's like looking for hemlock woolly adelgid is like looking for a needle in a haystack, but looking for the symptoms, of course, is the way to go. So if we don't have any other questions, I think I'm going to sign off here today, and I want to thank you, Andrew, for your wonderful presentation today, and remind everyone about next week's webinar, where we'll hear from 2 speakers. Luke Amos Binks from the Department of Natural Resources in New Brunswick on leveraging satellite imagery for forest health in New Brunswick, and Dr. Joanne White from the Canadian Forest Service in Victoria on mapping, validating, and interpreting spatial temporal trends in post-disturbance forest recovery. Once again, thanks very much, Andrew, and thank you everyone for participating today.
Thank you, everyone, and reach out if you have any interest in working with us to figure out better ways to merge what practitioners do and what researchers do.
Thank you, Andrew.